It's been a month since Houston Rockets GM Daryl Morey's pro-Hong Kong tweet put the NBA in the middle of a major controversy over how U.S. corporations should be doing business with China. Infamous China short seller Carson Block out with a fiery op-ed in the Financial Times saying that business leaders and entertainers should, quote, locate their spines quickly and put freedom of expression above their corporate greed. He goes on to say that China should be reminded that it can't rise without the help of others. Joining us now is Mr. Block. He is founder and CIO of Muddy Waters Research. Carson, it's great to have you. And we've asked a lot of U.S. companies lately, from Starbucks to Disney, to justify doing business in China. And the answer is everything from needing to be culturally correct to, in Starbucks' case today, trying to help the local communities that it's involved in. What do you think is the right posture for corporations here?
All right. So first of all, playing the Chinese government's game is conflating the Chinese Communist Party or the government with the Chinese people. Okay, so
Sure.
First thing we should do is we should separate these two concepts here because they're very different. So I'm not arguing that American companies should not do business in China, but what I'm arguing for is that they should avoid getting them being so dependent on China so that that China has this leverage to create this ridiculous situation where the Chinese government's attempting to censor a U.S. citizen in America. That is unacceptable if you let yourself become so leveraged to the China market that you would play along with that.
In other words,
so that is my exhortation.
Right. So to separate out what, the NBA issue and some of the others from the whole idea of doing business in China, what you're saying is companies should not let China censor their speech. And you're saying the NBA should not allow that. And they didn't. Daryl Morey's tweet went out. Adam Silver said he supported free speech and so forth. They've just been noticeably quiet ever since. But in the case of other companies who have changed their drop-down menus or T-shirts printed with the wrong imagery under pressure from China, you're saying that's where corporate America should stand up, that they shouldn't allow China to change what they're speaking or showing or asserting to be true about the country? So
that is one point on which you absolutely nailed it in terms of what my feeling is. We need to stop letting the Chinese government push our companies and our people around. But also, then you get to this Hong Kong issue. And so the other part of my op-ed is really focusing on Hong Kong being an important issue, because not just because Hong Kong in isolation is a really bad situation where, I don't know that the Chinese government ever had the intention of honoring this one country, two systems concept, but it's basically destroying that and has been for some time. Hong Kong is important because it is basically that bulwark, I think, between the Chinese government and how it does business, very corrupt, very corrosive, and the rest of the world. And for America and Americans who want to do business overseas, if Hong Kong is allowed to become what the CCP really wants it to become, which is basically one country, one system, we're going to find it harder to do business overseas, not just in Hong Kong, with people who share our values and believe in these values. The world will be remade more in the image of that the Chinese government wants it to be made in. And that's a problem for us if we want to engage with the rest of the world, which we need to, and we do.
Carson, what got me was your argument that companies, U.S. companies, shouldn't allow China to have so much leverage in terms of the impact on their businesses. But as a percent of revenues for a lot of U.S. companies, China is actually not that large, but it is one of the fastest growing areas. Apple, for instance, 20% of its revenues are from China. You would argue that theoretically, according to those numbers, in the U.S. is about 40%. According to those numbers, it's not dependent on China. But if we took away those sales, investors would sell that stock off. I mean, it's not just the companies saying we're not going to allow our business to be to be dependent on China, but investors are depending on the growth that is coming out of China.
Well, this really brings up an interesting point here because, I think that a lot of Americans, we talk about our politicians lacking principle, but I think a lot of Americans, we've also lost our sense of principle as well. I mean, investors, and I've been arguing for over a year, probably a year and a half, that Chinese stocks should be valued and considered to be sin stocks, basically, because there are a lot of strategic issues involved with these companies, and because they basically, many of them roll up to the Chinese government. Plus, you have that whole issue of you don't have any accountability for wrongdoing on the part of Chinese management. But getting to Apple, we do need to be more principled as investors here.
And on that note, and only because we're running out of time, and I'm curious how far you would take this as somebody who believes quite passionately about it. Would you stop using Apple products? Or other? Would you not buy something in Walmart that was made in China? I'm asking quite seriously here. If you think that the impetus should be that if you believe that China, as you say, is kind of a sin country, and I know you're referring to leadership, not the people, but how far are you willing to take that?
Well, so again, I am not arguing that companies should not do business in China or with China. But companies that make trade-offs, I mean, I definitely get grossed out when I think about these airlines who refuse to call it Taiwan anymore because China told them to. And if I have a choice not to fly that airline, that does pop into my head, and I will not fly that airline. I mean, if it's not about not buying things made in China in general, because this is not a problem with the Chinese people. This is a problem with the government and our companies giving it too much slack.
Every single company that does any business in China is making some sacrifice on principle. Would you agree with that? I mean, in order to get through the door in China, they're making some compromise. They have to.
But the compromises that they must not make are the compromises that extend beyond the territorial borders of the PRC. So when we start censoring Americans, and a great example is China's investment in Hollywood. I mean, now, China was the government's been super smart about this because Hollywood used to produce these films that were very pro-Dalai Lama, anti-Chinese government. And now, so many people in Hollywood are afraid to say boo about China and do anything other than portray it in the most positive light possible. I mean, to me, that's a real problem. So when we're getting extraterritorial application of Chinese censorship, that is where companies must draw the line. And if that means you don't take the investment in your film production company from China, then don't take that investment. That's principled.
All right. And that is a bold stance. Carson, thanks very much.